My name is Amanda Latray. I am the WISE Program Support Coordinator. I would like to also introduce Sharon Alistalo. She is WISE Program Director, so we're glad she's here with us as well. So without further ado, I do want to move on to our program today. This is really the second of two programs on developing your online professional profile. Last month, we had Jenny Stromer-Galley, Dr. Jenny Stromer-Galley, join us from the iSchool to talk about social media, how to effectively use that to develop your online profile. We have that recording available to you if you're interested. That's on our suwise.syr.edu website. And then today we're going to dive into research profile tools. So I'm really excited to introduce our two speakers this afternoon. Brenna Helmstutler is the librarian at the School of Information Studies. So welcome, Brenna. And then also we have Emily Hart. She is science librarian and research impact lead. So we really have two experts here to share a lot of their knowledge and experience with these tools. And I just want to remind everyone that the librarians are just the terrific resources for all of you. So yes, thank you, Sharon. They really are. So this is a great opportunity to connect with them today and to learn about what they can offer you, what support they can offer. So keep that in mind as well as you listen to them. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it to our wonderful speakers this afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks for the great introduction, Amanda. We appreciate it. Also, it looks like we have a fairly small group today. So if you have questions, feel free to unmute or pop them in the chat, and we'd be happy to answer them. I did get a couple questions that were submitted in the form prior to the presentation today, and we will try and address those a little bit as well. Do you have anything to add, Brenna, before we get started?
Oh, I think she, yep.
No, sorry.
No problem.
The mute. I don't have anything to add, but yes, definitely feel free to put your questions in the chat, and we will get to them throughout the program.
I think we are also going to try and do a little bit of hands-on, so feel free to, I know sometimes it's hard to juggle being in Zoom and doing, you know, a hands-on thing on the same computer. So feel free to follow along though if you'd like. So we have a PowerPoint that we're going to go through, and then like I said, we're going to try and break at a couple points and put in some hands-on so you can practice with these resources throughout. So I'm just going to wait. Brenna is driving the slides today. Thank you, Brenna. Okay. So when I think about what maximizing your visibility as a scholar, which is the name of our presentation today, a lot of it comes down to research reputation and like what you're putting out there. So what makes up a researcher's reputation, or again, a big piece of that, visibility? It's your outputs. So it's the things that you're creating, those publications, scholarly works, presentations. And then once you have those, what are you doing with it? So how are you sharing them? Are you talking about them anywhere? Those are really important pieces. So it's a cycle. So I've heard some people say before that I found this quote in an article and I really liked it. Someone said, my colleagues think that when you publish something, you're done. And, you know, that's the last step, but that's really only the beginning. You're trying to draw attention. So, you know, the more attention your works get, you know, maybe it's, you know, for our audience today, it might be getting that postdoc position. It might be getting an award or a grant, things like that. So, it's really important to have a presence as a professional, as a researcher. Next slide, please. Okay, so the first, again, piece in that puzzle is not only it's your scholarly work. So, and again, we're talking about how to draw attention to those scholarly works today. And one of the things that I'm going to start with is talking about where you're publishing and where you're putting those scholarly works. That is incredibly important, because where you're putting these things, again, draws attention. Is it open access? Is it visible to a lot of people? You know, the more visible it is, the more citations it's generating. So where you're putting these scholarly works, where you're publishing them, is a really big piece of this equation. So I'm going to start by talking about that a little bit. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think that the first thing you should do when you're thinking about, again, your scholarship and where you want to put it, is to ask yourself what your goals are before you even think about things like publishing. So some fields, there may be things like gateway publications where, you know, if you want to, well, in a faculty member's case, maybe it's tenure and promotion. You know, your discipline may recommend publish in X, Y, and Z journals to get tenure and promotion. There are obviously, we hope there are other ways to achieve that as well, but there are some disciplines that are pretty hardcore about publishing in specific journals, kind of those gateway publications. Is there a certain person or a certain audience that you know reads a certain publication, or you know, follows a certain website? Maybe you want to target that person. If your goal, maybe you're doing more public health related research, for example, maybe you really want your work to be available to the masses. So it's important for nonprofits to have access. So at least thinking about these things, about your goals for the, you know, before you start publishing or before you submit your publications or manuscripts, things like that, is an important step to take. You also, again, some other factors in the equation are looking at things like the quality of the places that you're publishing. And once you publish in these places, what are you allowed to do with those publications after the fact? So do you have reuse rights? Another thing that could come into play, you might be working in a research group or a lab where you have specific funding requirements, you have grant funding. And sometimes those funders, for example, like NIH or NSF, they require you to put a copy of any publications that come out of that research, that grant funded research, in an open access repository, like PubMed Central, for example. So that's another thing to consider, is does the journal I'm publishing in comply with funder mandates? So there are a lot of things to think about in this bigger picture. Next slide, please. Okay, thought it's important to just touch on different types of publishing models quickly, and this is primarily focused on journal publishing, but I think, again, it's important to understand this piece because a couple of these options lead to more visibility for your publications. So I'm just gonna, I know this is kind of small print, but we will be sharing the slides with you all afterwards if you want to go back and review this. But the first model is kind of the more traditional publishing model, where you submit your manuscript to a journal and there's no cost upfront to you. The cost comes into play where in things like library subscriptions, or you might go to Google Scholar and they're saying, and when you go to click on that article, it says pay $50 or have a subscription to access this article. That means it's behind a paywall. So unless you have subscription access or unless you have paid to access it, then you can't. So that's kind of that traditional model where it's not freely available to everybody. Gold is a type of publishing, or like another publishing model, and is typically associated with open access. So there are a couple ways that publishers make their works open access. And open access means basically freely available, so anyone can access that at no charge. So this is a model where the charges are placed on the authors. So you go to submit an article to a fully open access gold journal, and they say it's X amount of dollars to publish in this journal. Sometimes those They're called article processing charges. Sometimes those you may have funding through your lab, perhaps, or your research group potentially. So you can build, you can ask in your, if you do a grant proposal, sometimes you can build that language into the grant proposal and say that you'd like, one of your goals is to publish open access. And, you know, you can try and request or build in those APC charges into your budget. So that's one approach. Sometimes there are funds for at the university level for things like article processing charges. The libraries at SU do not cover article processing charges. We do have some agreements with specific publishers, and the list is very small, but where you can do things like get discounts to publish in that journal, so the APC may be reduced. But we are working on getting a list of those specific publishers that we work with on our website more, so it's more readily available. There's another version called Gold, another version of Gold open access journals that are not based on authors paying charges to publish. And that's often associated with, like it says here, society publishers. So you may belong to a society, and you know, the dues and things for that society cover the cost of the journals published by that society. So hybrid journals are, if you submit a manuscript to a specific journal, you have the option to make that article open access. So they would at that point say, you can pay this article processing charge and make your article open access, or you can do it the traditional way, and that article then remains behind that paywall again. And the paywall means that people can't access it unless they have a subscription to that journal, or unless they have paid for individual costs for that article. Green open access. This is the one that I really want you to pay attention to. So many publishers now will allow you to post a version of your manuscript to an institutional repository. The institutional repository at Syracuse University is called Surface, and that's where we post things like dissertations and theses. So once you submit your dissertation or thesis, we retain a copy of that in our institutional repository. If I publish an article and the journal that I publish in says that I have the rights to publish on an institutional repository or on something like PubMed Central, where I deposit a copy there, then they will say that I have the rights, or the reuse rights to do so. So I jumped ahead a little bit there. Let me back up. So basically, I'm going to go into the different versions of manuscripts in a second. And again, some publishers allow you to put what's called a postprint in an institutional repository or on a personal website. And that is one of the ways that you can make your works open access without having to pay that article processing charge or publish in a fully open access gold journal. Okay, so it's something, again, that's really important for doing things like generating interest in your works. So if your work is behind a paywall and people can't access it, it's going to get less attention and potentially generate less citations. So there will be less people citing your works. So having an open access version is a really important step to maximizing the visibility of your publications. Next slide, please. Okay, manuscript versions. So I go to publish an article. I have a manuscript, and this could be the same with a book chapter as well that goes through a peer review process. But so I have, I'm writing a manuscript. My goal is to publish in a journal. The first version of my manuscript is called preprint, and basically it's just a draft. So it is before I actually submit it to a peer-reviewed journal. There are things called preprint servers. A lot of you may have heard of the server archive. There is also, there are a bunch of There's a server called BioArchive out there. There are places where you can put your, again, first version before peer review, and other people can comment on it, and you can kind of get, it's an open peer review process. So it generates attention for your research. Some people are reluctant to do this because they maybe aren't ready to share their results at this stage of the research. But anyway, so that's before you actually submit to the journal is your preprint. After you've submitted to the journal and you have gotten accepted to a specific journal, and then they give you sometimes multiple rounds of edits. Once you've gone through all the resubmission process of those edits, that is considered your post print. So again, I'm going to go through this again. So you submit to a journal, you have your first draft, and then the reviewers of that journal comment on your draft and they say, yes, you are accepted, or no, you're rejected. And if your article is accepted, again, you go through multiple rounds of revisions, and you're going through the peer review process at that point. Once you've gone through all those rounds of revisions and your article or that draft of the article has been peer reviewed, that is called your post print. The next step is to get it actually published and copy edited and it looks pretty, and then it's published finally in the final version of the journal. Anyway, does anyone have questions about that? Because I did I think I got through all the points, but it was kind of rough. But basically that post print is what you can share oftentimes on a personal website or in an institutional repository like Surface, or sometimes you'd put it in, again, if you're have an NIH grant, you may post it in PubMed Central. Okay, based on mandates. Mm-hmm.
I did want to point out, we have a question in the chat. So I don't know if you want me to read it to you, I can, or if you can.
Post pub rights to post a publication. That's a great question. So in a minute, we're going to do an activity and we're going to look at a website that shows you where you can learn about whether you have the right, do you have the author reuse rights to actually post your article in, like I said, an institutional repository. And then they'll also tell you what version. So some journals will allow you to publish that final, again, copy edited, that final version that actually is published in the journal. Sometimes they'll allow you to put that in an institutional repository, but more often the case is that they'll let you have that post print. And another way to say post print is the final author manuscript. So again, it's the last time you touch that draft of your article before it's submitted for like final copy editing to the journal. So again, that post print has gone through the peer review process. It's been edited multiple times. Okay, so let's next slide, please. Okay, preprints. I talked a little bit about this again, but this is before you submit to a journal or before you submit to a publisher. And I'm not going to go into too much detail on this, but a lot of people feel that preprints are a great way to draw attention to your work. So if, again, you're working on trying to publish your research, this is a step to consider in the process. Some publishers also have a workflow set up now where if you post to something like BioArchive or Archive, they can actually do things like, I don't know the specific process, but their system will talk to Archive and pull in that manuscript. So that edited version of the manuscript into their kind of journal system. So some publishers are now recognizing the importance, and even some publishers like Elsevier have their own preprint server now. So it is an accepted kind of part of the process where people are posting their works before they're submitting to the journal. It's in the case of something like COVID research, it was a way to get information out there rapidly. So because the peer review process and going through journal publication can take years sometimes. Sometimes, you know, you won't even hear back from an author or from a publisher for months about whether you're even accepted or rejected and get to move to that next phase or not. So again, preprints kind of move research along at a much quicker pace. And again, draw attention to your work. Next slide, please. Okay, so another way to draw attention to your work is, aside from that actual manuscript that you're publishing or that you're trying to publish in a journal, or you know, a book chapter that you're trying to go through an official publisher, you can publish different pieces of your work as well. So you can publish things like data sets, your data instruments like your surveys, your code that you're writing, books, book chapters, conference proceedings, presentations and posters, reports. These are all your scholarly work that you want to make sure that it's out there in some way and getting attention. Again, maybe drawing attention back to, well, just your research in general. One of the ways to do that is, again, to put it on an institutional repository like Surface. There are other repositories out there, especially for things like data. Common ones are Open Science Framework, Figshare, Mendeley Data. You can also, the other piece of this is that you want to, when you submit an article to a publisher, they typically assign your article a DOI. And that's a digital object identifier. So it's something that gives it a unique string or a unique number that identifies your article. And it also makes it very findable and citable. So these other types of works that don't go through that official kind of process of the journal, of publishing in a journal, or again, a mainstream publisher for a book. There are websites like, again, if you submit something to Surface, which is our institutional repository, you can request to get a DOI for your work. And again, that's that digital object identifier. If you submit your data set to Open Science Framework, you can get a DOI. Mendeley Data does DOIs. If you have code, again, you submit it to GitHub, and then there's another service they work with called Zenodo that gives you a DOI. Again, so what it does is, you know, you're not just looking at that final published manuscript in a journal anymore. You're also publishing different pieces of your work along the way. Again, your data instruments, and then getting a DOI for it, making it discoverable, and again, drawing attention to your work. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I think I probably covered this to some degree, but again, open access is really important. And it doesn't have to be, again, that fully gold open access that I showed you in terms of like the different types of publication options, but it could also be that green open access where you put your post print available on a repository. But open access, again, makes your works more widely available to people. It's not behind that paywall, so you don't have to have a subscription to access it. Important things to know about open access is that it helps with equity to information. It helps do things like advanced research because more people have access to research if it's not behind a paywall. And again, it depends on what your goals are for your research as well. If you're doing something that involves like climate change, it's important to get that information out there. You want that wide audience to see it, okay? Anyway, and it also, I think I mentioned this before, but open access can help you increase your citation counts because your research is more visible. Next slide, please. Okay. This is an important point to note. Open access does not equate to predatory publishing. So a lot of the journals, so I should say, there are ways that you can evaluate a journal's quality or a publisher's quality. And I'm going to talk about those really briefly. But open access in some cases has gotten a bad rap because a lot of the publishers that are kind of considered predatory publishers have gone the open access route. So they will say things like, they'll do a solicitation and they'll say, if pay X amount of money and we'll make your, we'll publish your journal article fast, and then we'll make it available open access. And the goal of that publishing group is not quality. Often their peer review process is poor, and there are a lot of flaws with predatory publishers. But again, there are really wonderful open access journals out there. And so predatory publishers that maybe have an open access component has nothing to do with the quality overall of open access publishing, if that makes sense. Okay, so I'm going to show you a couple of quick slides. Next slide, please, about identifying high quality publishers. And I think I might be running out of time for this section of the presentation. So I'm just going to go through this really quickly. When you're looking at publishing, you should always do a check of the publisher's website. Do you know someone else that has published there? Does the website look professional? Do you know anyone on their editorial board? What do they say about their peer review process? Have they tried to solicit you? Have they tried to ask again, or said anything about, I'm going to publish your journal article, I'll publish your manuscript quickly? Those are sometimes indicators of just people, they're out to make money. They're not out to, again, do quality science, for example. You can also check on a journal by seeing if it has what its metrics are. And the places that I have listed here are places where you can go and you can see if it has an impact factor, for example. Impact factor is just one journal metric. And Brenna's actually going to talk about this a little bit in her section, so I won't go into it now, but it's basically an indication that that journal is a reputable journal and other people are citing things published in that journal. So it's a level of quality. Next slide, please. Another way to check is to see if that journal is indexed in any of the places that I have listed on this slide. For example, Web of Science and Scopus are both large literature indexes that we subscribe to through SU. And they, in order to be included in their index, they've done a quality check on all the publications that are included. Same thing with Directory of Open Access Journals and the others I have listed. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is a very dense slide and I don't expect you to read it now. But basically what it says are that there are a couple places, and this is refers again to the question that was in the chat, where you can go to check to see what a journal's policies are on copyright and author reuse. One of the websites that I use most frequently, and this is free, is called Sherpa Romeo. Other things I mentioned on this slide and this is, if you go into Sherpa Romeo and you search for your journal, it can be difficult to kind of suss out what they're talking about when they're talking about the author reuse rights. So one of the things that you could potentially see are that a journal may have an embargo. So essentially they may say, yes, you can post your you can put your postprint or your final author manuscript in a repository, but you have to wait a year from when it was published. That's considered an embargo, a specific period of time before that you have to wait before you can make it available publicly. And then funder mandates, I did touch on this briefly before, but funder mandates are, again, if you have a grant for something like NIH or NSF or any other government agency, there are others as well, but there is a mandate that you make your publications available openly. So they have to be, you have to make them available in some form of open access, whether it's your, again, post-print or final author manuscript or the final published version of that article. You have to make it available somewhere for the public to access. Okay, next slide, please. Just wanted to, again, mention Surface. Surface is our institutional repository at Syracuse. So we highly encourage you to work Surface into your, Surface into your workflow when you're publishing. Basically, again, I had mentioned, so if I publish an article, I have gone to Sherpa Romeo, I have checked the author reuse rights, and it says, yes, I can include a copy of my post-print or my final author manuscript in a repository. So my next step would be to take that version of my article and submit it to Surface for inclusion in Surface. And again, what that does is it's helping you increase the attention that your work is getting. It's another place where people can find your stuff, okay? And that's regardless of whether that journal that you published in is behind a paywall or not. There is an open access version of your work in Surface. So it's a really good option to keep in mind. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, what we're gonna do is I want you to take 5 minutes and you're gonna go to this website. I'm also going to pop this website into the chat. What I want you to do is pick your favorite journal. It could be one that you're trying to publish in, one that you have published in, one that you read often for class, something, any of those options, just your favorite journal. Okay, again, so I'm putting the link in the chat as well. Again, you're going to go to this website and try and interpret what Sherpa Romeo is saying about the reuse rights for that specific journal. Feel free to unmute if you have questions or just any observations about what you're seeing. Would anyone like to share what they've found? I should say also, again, it is somewhat difficult to interpret what they're saying sometimes in Sherpa Romeo. So if you have questions, you can feel free to reach out to myself or Brenna anytime, or any of the subject librarians should be kind of versed in the copyright and reuse policies.
Emily, I'm happy to share what came up for one that I have here.
Sure, that'd be awesome.
Just because I'd love your interpretation.
Okay.
So for the published version, it says no embargo, copyright owner authors, location author's homepage, and non-commercial institutional repository. So the conditions are published source must be acknowledged. That sounds pretty good to me, but I want to make sure that I'm right.
Did it say specifically what version it was as well, or was it?
It was published version.
That's awesome. That's the best you can ask for. So basically what they said was you can take the final published version. So again, the one that's edited and you can find on the publisher's website and everything. You can take that version. Amanda, you could post it on your personal website. You could also and should submit it to Surface, and you could also include it in the institutional repository. And I believe that that would also include if you, again, had any kind of mandates because you had received grant funding for your research, you could put it in something like PubMed Central as well.
Thank you.
So yes, thank you for sharing that example. That was really helpful. I just want, before we switch gears, because Brenna's going to do a different topic, I just wanted to reiterate one more time. So if you remember nothing else that I said, please remember that where you publish impacts the attention that you get as a scholar, as a researcher, okay? All the other details, you can reach out to your librarian and we'd be more than happy to work through it with you. But it's just important, before you publish somewhere, stop, think about where you're publishing, think about what their copyright and reuse policies are, because that's really important in the attention your work can receive down the road. The other thing that is really important to remember is it's not just your final published work, it's things like preprints, it's getting those DOIs for your data sets, your data instruments, your code, making sure that all of that is available and citable. I see that there is a question in the chat. It says, do these embargoes or limitations also apply if you're wanting to share articles through services like ResearchGate? For example, sometimes fellow researchers will ask for a copy of your paper or chapter. Okay, so those are two separate things. Okay, my response to this is you should not put PDF versions on ResearchGate or academia.edu or any other research profile service. And because in copyright and reuse policies, that would not be considered a personal website or an institutional repository. Those are services that are, they're making money, okay? You should absolutely, if you have a research profile, you should include that publication with a link to where it's located in an institutional repository or on, I don't know if you'd want to link back to it on your personal website. You probably could, but I think that you're probably better off putting that kind of official copy in a repository somewhere. And the other reason that you put the copy in the repository is that your personal website might go away, but we have really strict standards for how we archive and maintain our publications and our data in the institutional repository. So it's kind of like putting, this is a really bad like comparison, but putting money in the bank. You know, the bank is going to be there, you hope, for a long time and it's taking care of your stuff. Okay. So again, so don't put a copy of your works on ResearchGate or other profiling services. Put it in the repository. That's your best bet. The other piece of this is, can you share things with a colleague? Yes, that is typically accepted. Again, if you post it places, that's another thing, but if you typically do have the rights to share a few copies with colleagues or, you know, friends, I guess. So those are two separate things. Did that answer the question? Great. And again, I am going to talk more about research profiles a little bit later in the presentation. So we'll cover a little bit more of that then. I'm going to pass it off to Brenna now. Thanks, everybody.
Hey, thanks, Emily. So what I'll be talking about definitely complements what Emily was just talking about as far as identifying journals, finding the kind of information that you need to find. So what I'll be focusing on right now is metrics. She mentioned that a little bit earlier in terms of indicators for journals. There's a lot of different kinds of metrics that you can use though. So this will kind of help you as you are either looking for a journal or later on, once you've published in a journal or another work, how your work has impacted the research in terms of a measure or metric. So we'll be kind of focusing on that part now. So basically, in terms of guidelines, because there are a lot of metric tools out there, there's more and more all the time. This has been happening for several years now as metrics has kind of taken on a little bit more prominence in the research area. So it's important to note that one tool does not fit all for a variety of reasons. So you may, you know, once you have kind of looked at all of them or several, you can kind of make your best judgment as to which ones you would like to use, which ones you should use in order for your visibility, but also just to give your research the best visibility it can be, not just visibility for the sake of it, but quality visibility. So a lot of factors go into the fact that one tool does not fit all. One is publication experience. There are some metrics that favor sort of veteran researchers over new researchers. One prime example of that is the H-index, which you may have heard about. This typically is a formula that draws from the number of publications one has. So that tends not to be as positive for new researchers because they obviously don't have as many publications. So that's just an example of a metric that doesn't favor everybody and shouldn't be used by everybody. Another example of one tool does not fit all is the type of publication. And this kind of goes hand in hand with the next bullet point, which is the discipline. So the type of publication can vary in terms of what kinds of metrics are available or indicators. And then going back to what Emily was talking about as far as the quality journal, if it's been cited many times, if it's indexed in various databases, if it has that kind of level of quality, and then also just looking at the type itself, whether it's a journal article, a book chapter, conference proceedings, that can vary in terms of the metrics that are available, but also what kinds of indicators are there. And we'll be taking a deeper look into metrics and what they look like in different tools. And then also, as I was just mentioning, the discipline, metrics and what should be used can vary a lot by discipline. So what could be a great indicator for the sciences may not be good at all for arts and humanities because the disciplines are so different. The publishing cycles are so different because typically in the sciences, there's a lot of publishing that's done and a lot of types of publications that lend themselves to metrics like journal articles, conference proceedings, things like that. Whereas arts and humanities have kind of a different way of contributing to research and different works, which I think is growing very slowly in terms of trying to track those kinds of works, but it's very different. And traditionally, the metrics that have been used have favored the sciences because of the types of publishing that is done. So all of this is important to sort of look at as you're kind of looking further into the different ways you can publish, but also looking at the different kinds of metrics that can be used along with those. So this is kind of a very rough chart of looking at sort of as I was just talking about, the traditional metrics, which are called bibliometrics on the first side, and then on the right side, Altmetrics, which have been, I think they've been sort of in the kind of the metrics area for about 10 years or so. So still very new, but they're gaining more attention because of some of the advantages of using them. So I'll just quickly go through these. And this is sort of a comparison chart. So with Bibliometrics, it's based on citation. So because of that, it can take time to build as far as like for citation counts, for example. So especially if there's maybe a book or a journal, it may take time for manuscripts to be reviewed and to actually appear in a journal. And sometimes that can take years, sometimes not as much. But even so, once it's published in a particular database or a particular journal, it can take time for that to gain attention and build, so that as people continue to conduct research, they're citing these articles. So that can take some time to really build the high numbers that we typically see in like really highly cited works. So that can take several years to build. So the opposite of that is Altmetrics, because a lot of it is, or I'd say all of it is based on sort of the online attention or online impact. So it's a lot more immediate. So if you sort of maybe share your work or links to it, I should say, in maybe on a Twitter post or Facebook, such as what Jenny Stromer-Galley was talking about in her talk last month, that can sort of be more immediate, because you can often, you can measure the attention you get through your tweets. If you tweet about, I just published this article, it's available through this link, or I just presented on this topic and my slides I've made available here, things like that. So that can be a lot more immediate. So for new researchers in particular, this can be very useful, because you're not sort of waiting for the citations to happen, but you're instead being able to see sort of that more immediate impact. And as the next line suggests, whereas bibliometrics are indicators of significant research, because it has taken that time to build and gain prominence in the field, Altmetrics can be an indicator of future bibliometrics. So if there's maybe a journal article that really gets a lot of attention through different social media outlets or blog posts, things like that, that could be an indicator that as time goes on, there may be, because of that attention that was gained early on, they receive more citations, because there was that early attention. And once people saw that it was available in a more traditional way, that can gain more citations. So it can be kind of an interesting way to look at it. So if you have kind of a lot of good online attention for your work and impact, it could be an indicator that you will have the more traditional metrics building as well. And just the next line is some typical keywords that you may see with bibliometrics. You may hear about or read about bibliometrics in terms like citation counts, H-index, which I just briefly mentioned earlier, and impact factor, which Emily mentioned, as well as citation counts. And then with Altmetrics, you may see terms like Altmetrics is kind of focused more on downloads, blog posts, number of mentions. So again, it's not really based on the citation number, since that's kind of attached to the traditional bibliometrics, but instead you're looking at kind of more, as the name suggests, more alternative ways of looking at attention or impact, like how many people are downloading this article, how many people are viewing this article or have clicked on it. So that can be, a good tool, as I mentioned earlier, for early or new researchers to take a look at. And it's also a good supplement as well, even if you have a lot of articles that have a lot of citations, it still can be a great supplement to also use Altmetrics, because you're also looking at both sort of sides of the coin in terms of not just the traditional metrics, but also these metrics that can sort of be sort of more immediate and sort of maybe a newer way of looking at metrics. So it can be helpful to use both, or to use Altmetrics depending on your length of time as a researcher. And then the next slide refers to where you can typically see these, and I'll be showing you screenshots of what these look like shortly. But both of them do show in at the article level, the journal level, and the author level. So we'll be taking a look at those. And then both of them can be found in databases and websites. So those two are fairly the same in terms of where you can find them. There are a couple of websites that use Altmetrics sort of exclusively, but the ones I'll be showing you use kind of a combination of both in most cases. So I'll be showing you that so you can sort of see what that actually looks like. And just moving on, these are just an example of some research tools that have metrics included. And as time has gone on, there's more and more availability of metrics within research databases, because this is sort of gaining interest, so that researchers can not only have, say, citation counts, but they can have other measures built in as well to make that a really kind of full to make full use of a researcher, what a researcher may be looking for, not just is my article in here, how many citations do I have, but also how many people have downloaded my article, or how many have viewed it, things like that. So that can be very useful. As Emily was mentioning earlier, it can be very useful for tenure and promotion. It can be useful for grant applications. It can be useful for, you can add this sort of data to your personal website if you have one. So it can be used in a lot of interesting ways. You can put them on your CV next to your, maybe your article, and talking about how many sites it may have, or if there's other numbers that you have, just so you can get a full picture of, not only have I published this article, but here are some measures of how this work has impacted the field. So that can just be kind of a enhancement of your research, and definitely the visibility issue as well. So these three that I'll be showing you screenshots of are Scopus and Web of Science, and both of these are subscription databases that we have in our databases list on the SU Libraries website. They both have a lot of scientific types of articles, but it's pretty interdisciplinary as well. So almost any discipline can use these and find corresponding citations. And then the third one is Experts at Syracuse, which is not a database in the traditional sense, but it is a kind of a research profiler site. So I'll be showing you that. This is a
Brenna?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to
Yes,
interrupt,
go
but I
ahead.
do want to point out we have a question in the chat. So I thought maybe we
Okay.
could just address that before we move on. And if you
Sure.
want me to read it, I can.
I can pull it up here. Let's see. Okay, blog post means writing your own blog, or does it mean commenting on other people's? I guess referring to how many, I guess it could be either potentially. I think it probably is more useful when other people are talking about your work. So they might be talking about a certain topic, and they may say, well, this work by Archie has a really interesting perspective on this topic, or something like that. So that can, just refer to just any kind of attention or mention of your work, your name, the kind of research you're doing. So that way, so I guess it probably is more for other people when other people are talking about you. But this does sort of relate to kind of what the talk last month was about sort of selling yourself and sort of mentioning maybe if you just published an article and providing a link to it on Twitter. So that can definitely be where you mention yourself, and also, you know, sort of getting that out, but then the mentions can be from other people that are sort of saying, hey, this is this perfectly sort of talks about what people in the field are talking about or something like that. So it's basically referring to other people talking about your work, if that answers the question. Okay.
Thank you, Brenna.
Sure. So this is a screenshot of a Scopus author view. So this is kind of an author level metric view of what you can see. And because Scopus is as I said, sort of a multidisciplinary database. And this is a female professor from the iSchool. And as you can see, this is just a brief screenshot. So it's not even all of the content that you can see. But as you can see very quickly, you can see their Orcid ID is connected here, as well as their Scopus ID. And then they can also, and as you can see, anyone can see this kind of view. And then if you are this researcher, you can edit your profile and do other things. But if you're looking at this researcher, you can set alerts for any new articles, any kind of author matches to them. But below this, you see some kind of interesting visualizations and sort of collection of metrics. So what you can see here from Scopus is you can see the number of documents by author, and Scopus uses the term documents instead of articles. And so that just refers to 77 works by the author, because it could be articles or it could be conference proceedings, etc. And then you can see that over 3,000 citations by over 2,000 documents. So that's definitely a highly cited author from Scopus. So if you were this researcher and you wanted to document this and say a tenure and promotion statement, you could say, according to Scopus, these are the metrics that I have. Because as I was saying earlier, since one tool does not fit all, you would want to sort of specify the types of like the different metrics that you're seeing from particular databases, because they're all going to have different kinds of data, different kinds of numbers. So it's important to sort of qualify where you sort of retrieve the information, because there's not just one source that can be used for everything, unfortunately. So you can also see here, there's a visualization of document and citation trends. So you can kind of see when they've done a lot of works or when they've been cited a lot as well. And you can see the time period between 1996 and 2021. And then over here, you can see, and this is cut off a little bit, which I apologize for, but this is most contributed topics. So this is really helpful too, if you, as a student, are interested in maybe finding a faculty mentor, or maybe just someone to talk to about your research. It can kind of give you some guidelines there. So this can be used for a variety of things, not only as the author themselves to sort of look at and sort of collect their metrics and to see what their impact is, but also it can be used by other researchers that are looking for people to collaborate with or mentor with. And these are just some additional researcher features of Scopus. So as you can see, Scopus is very strong and robust in the kind of metrics they provide. One interesting one that I'll note is that they have a couple of metrics that sort of look at the discipline and the source as they're looking at the formula, whereas traditionally the formulas have just been kind of cut and dry, regardless of the discipline, regardless of the type of work. But the field-weighted citation impact and source normalized impact per paper kind of take into consideration the discipline and the source instead of just looking at it in a more absolute way, like as was done with the more traditional metrics. So it's a little bit closer to sort of an accurate number based on that discipline or source, instead of just, attributing a number that has a measure, just across the board, regardless of the discipline. So it kind of looks at that a little bit more carefully, which is nice. And this is an example of a citation from Web of Science. So this is kind of looking at an article level metric. So as you can see in Web of Science, you can see the number of times cited, and then you can see the number of times cited in all databases, and then all the references that they have used themselves. So that just gives you a quick look at that, and you can always look at the author more closely and link to them there. So that is just a sort of a different database to use in terms of looking at the article level of metrics. And this is an example of journal level metrics where you can see, and this is journal citation reports. I don't think that's very clear here, but this journal citation reports is based on Web of Science data. So it will provide data from that. So not all journals are in here, but this can be a way to maybe look at the top 10 journals in the sciences, for example. So it's a little bit more science friendly, I would say, or social sciences. So you could, if you just wanted to get a list like there is here of like the top journals in a particular field. And this field is, I believe, information science that I called. And so this will give you some metrics here, like the total number of sites of that journal, the journal impact factors we talked about earlier, and then the eigenfactor score as well. So it can give you, as we were talking about earlier with the predatory journals, this can sort of give you an indicator of the level of impact of that journal. So that can be very useful. And also just looking at the ranked journals can be useful, knowing that this isn't the only journal tool out there, but it's one of the ones that can be used for ranking journals. There's other, I believe Emily linked to this earlier, but Simago as well is another way to sort of get a list of ranked journals. You can also in journal citation reports, look up a particular journal to see what their impact factor is. And lastly, this is the Experts at Syracuse site, and this just gives you a brief look at what the main page looks like. So basically, this can also be used by students to find mentors or faculty researchers that may be connected to research interests. So this includes research active faculty profiles, and you can also you can look at an individual faculty profile. You can also look at your department, school, or college and sort of get a broader look at that. As you can see here, I think this is blocking that. Whoops. So you can see that there's different categories available. There's research output, activities, grants, projects. So it's a great way to sort of collect the research of what is being conducted at SU specifically. So it's not as compared to the other tools that we've looked at that have looked at sort of every, sort of a more international look. This is just for SU researchers, but it also does have a look at their collaborators. So that can just be a really interesting source for students to use to look at. And we do have COVID-19 research kind of highlighted here. And if you go to the site, this is linked so you can go to that particular output to see what's there. And let's see, I'm going to try to get through this a little bit more swiftly so we can get to the more important things. Examples of tools with Altmetrics, that includes Impact Story, Experts at Syracuse, which we've looked at a little bit already, and Surface, which Emily discussed. So this is an example of an Impact Story profile. So this is just going back to those Altmetrics, sort of collecting mentions. Like this shows the number of online mentions over a year, and then where they're coming from. And then these they have different achievement badges based on different things. Like this one is based on how many of your papers are free to read online, sort of going back to that open access perspective. And then also global reach, sort of looking at how many countries have looked at your work or seen it. And then it has a list of publications here, then the number of any kind of mentions, things like that. So this can be kind of a good starting point for, sort of collecting mentions or, things like that, like we've talked about earlier. So this is kind of a separate, sort of a free website. It's free to join. I think you just need a Twitter account to get started with it. And then you can sort of connect your other profiles, which Emily will be talking about. So I'll kind of get through this a little bit faster so she can get to that. And then this is an example of an expert's look at the article level. And I just wanted to show you this part here, which is PlumX, which is an Altmetric indicator. As you can see here, this pulls from a lot of different things like number of citations, but it also looks at usage in terms of how many people have viewed the abstract, how many people have viewed the full text link, and then captures, how many people have exported this or read it. And then you can see additional details here, but this is just an example of the kind of Altmetrics that you can find within a website like Experts at Syracuse. And also here you can see different fingerprints that are attached to research interests, keywords, things like that. And then this is just another example of Altmetrics used in Surface. So we talked about Surface earlier, which is our digital repository or institutional repository. And so this particular article here has several kinds of indicators here. So as you can see, there are 66 shares, likes, and comments that are collected. So this can be, if you do submit your work, which we have encouraged you to do to Surface, you can get these really great kind of measures as well. So you're not only enhancing the visibility of your work, but you can also see the advantages of that as these are pretty high numbers here from an article that came out 3 years ago. So that's pretty good. Okay, I think we may have to skip this just for time purposes. But what you're welcome to do, if you have any extra time, which none of us usually have, but if you sort of are interested in this or want to take a further look, you can maybe look up a faculty member that has maybe interesting research, or look up your maybe your department to see what kinds of research has been done using one of the tools that we've talked about. And then you can look for citation counts and Altmetrics just to kind of get a sense of what kind of impact they have. And as we've said, if you have questions or just want to talk about this more, you're welcome to get in touch with Emily or myself. but I think we'll skip this just so we have plenty of time here. So Emily, you can go on to your part.
Thanks, Brenna. I guess before we go on, does anyone have questions about metrics? I'm going to talk now a little bit about research profiles. We can always come back to this at the end if you can save your questions for the end as well. So basically, just in thinking about this in terms of the process, again, the title of the talk today is Maximizing Your Visibility as a Scholar. So the first part we talked about is disseminating your work. So thinking about where you're publishing, and if you're not publishing, it's your presentations, your reports, your data. Where and how are you sharing those? And how you do that directly relates back to how much attention it's getting. And Brenna talked about metrics, and metrics are the measure of how much attention those publications are getting, or how much attention an author is getting. You can also look at things like journal metrics as an indicator, again, of how the quality of a specific publication when you're deciding or making that choice. So another big thing that you can do is you can create research profiles. So again, you're publishing, you're measuring the impact of your research, and then you're showcasing it. So Brenna, could you go next slide, please? Okay, so research profiles, we did get a couple questions prior to the presentation today, and some of those questions were kind of, how important is a research profile, and which profiles are important, and do I need to have things like a picture on my research profile? So I'm going to start by just talking about why you would have a research profile. So your research profile, again, helps you maximize your visibility. It's a place where you're talking about yourself professionally, as opposed to a social media site that's devoted to like your personal connections. This is your profile of your research and your scholarship. So it's driving attention to the work. And again, the more you can drive attention to your work, the more citations it's going to get, the more mentions it's going to get on social media. This is a really important part. Having a research profile can help with things like disambiguation and misappropriation. And what that means is there are a lot of people out there with very similar sounding names. So one example that we have at SU actually is there are faculty members in College of Engineering and Computer Science who've been wonderful faculty members for a long time, active in research, and they have the same last name, two spouses. They also have, and their initials are CD, and then they also have a son or a daughter that have those same initials, and that son or daughter is also very active in publishing. So if you were to search for them on Google Scholar, there'd be 3 people with those same initials and last name. So that's an example of where you want to differentiate yourself from other people. And it also, sometimes when you're setting up profiles, you can get things like they may accredit someone else's work, or like a person with a similar name, they may accredit that person's work to you, or vice versa. Someone else might take credit for your work. So having these profiles and making sure that you're curating them in the way you want is a defense against making sure you're the one getting credit for your work, if that makes sense. One of the most important profiles that you can get to do this is Orcid. It's called an Orcid ID, and it's basically a unique identifier that you sign up for. It's a free account, and basically as a researcher, it gives you a unique number or string. And you also have a profile associated with that Orcid ID. But the other thing an Orcid ID is very good for, aside from, again, distinguishing you from other researchers, Orcid IDs are often asked for when you publish. So publishers will say, submit your manuscript, please include your Orcid ID with this. So submit your paper to this conference or your presentation to this conference. We'd also like to have your Orcid ID. If you're submitting a grant, they're probably going to ask for your Orcid ID. The Orcid ID also helps you populate other profiles. So if you're setting up a Google Scholar profile or potentially something on like ResearchGate or those other academic research profiles, oftentimes Orcid is something you can connect to your profile and it will automatically input your publications. That's not across the board, but it is a common one that, again, if you have that Orcid ID, you can use it to populate other things. So the other reason you'd have these research profiles is it's a lot easier in some cases to have a site like Google Scholar or Orcid. Basically, they can go out and they auto search for your publications and add them to your profile, as opposed to you having to set up a personal website and curating that website yourself. So it's also a time saver in many cases. So when you're setting up these profiles, like I said, Orcid is a big one. You want to probably do that first. But when you're setting them up, the very same thing that I said helps and is a time saver, it auto pulls in your publications, tries to auto match things, can also be a problem. You want to make sure that when you set up your Google Scholar profile or your ResearchGate profile, you want to make sure that the list that they're pulling in and matching to, to your name and your Orcid are there, that those are all your publications. So you can actually, some sites will let you go through and manually edit or review your publications. So you make sure when you're setting it up, you want to make sure that you do that. The other thing is I have a Google Scholar profile and I often get emails from Google Scholar and they'll say things like, it's time to update your profile. And they may have found a new publication that I just put out. And then you would go in and you can review that publication to see if it's actually your publication, for one, and to make sure there's no duplication with other things that you have on your profile. But it's that's actually a pretty nice feature of Google Scholar, is that they send you that email and checking in and saying, we think we found something for you, but is it actually yours? Do you want to add this to your profile? Something else I didn't mention here, it might be on a different slide, but when you're setting up for these research profiles, especially I believe that most of you are graduate students or postdocs in the audience, you probably want to sign up with a personal email address and not your SU email address. That's going to help you down the road maintain these profiles, because likely you may go on to a job or a different institution or a postdoc position. So again, having that in your personal email will help with the longevity of that account. Okay, let's see. I did talk about some of these, again, so making sure that you're actually curating your list and monitoring your profiles going forward. The other thing is, just to briefly touch on this again, I mentioned it earlier in the presentation, but don't post PDFs to these research profiles. If you're going to post PDFs of your, like your postprint or preprint, do it on one of those established repositories and then link to it from your profile. Companies like ResearchGate have been sued in the past for posting, by publishers. In some cases, authors posted those PDFs of their articles or their publications, and in some cases, I believe they were auto-harvested by ResearchGate. So the goal of those companies, while it is a good place to get attention for your research, the goal of those companies is to make money. So you want to be careful, okay? Next slide, please. Okay, so these are some of the common research profiles that are out there where you can set up accounts. Again, I mentioned Orcid. Another one, if you are doing a lot of book publishing, I have not used this before, so I can't really speak to it, but it's the Virtual International Authority File. So I believe it's similar to an Orcid ID, but it's for, if you're heavily invested in publishing books or book chapters. Google Scholar Citations, it's basically the same as your Google Scholar profile, but the Google Scholar Citations page is where you go in and you edit your profile. And again, you can curate and edit your list of publications that they've included for you. LinkedIn is another one. Again, kind of Orcid, Google Scholar, LinkedIn. Pretty much, again, everyone is using those. Google Scholar and LinkedIn, especially if you are someone that's in the job market and looking for, you know, again, a job or a postdoc position or a graduate position, things like that. Those are very visible sites. So you want to have a presence on those sites. LinkedIn, you can actually curate your publications list within LinkedIn. And Brenna is going to talk about this briefly, but we have something called the Research Metrics Challenge that kind of walks you through setting up some of these profiles, including LinkedIn, and how to make that more focused on your research and your scholarship. Other ones that you should consider are Mendeley is a citation management program, but it also has a profile section where you can set up a page where it other people can follow you. So if I was on Mendeley and you had a profile on Mendeley and I was interested in your research, I could click the follow button and then it would alert me when you had new publications and things like that. So again, it's more of a social media tool. And ResearchGate and academia.edu are popular research profile services. But again, I'd say that ResearchGate and academia.edu are more focused again on, they're trying to make money. So they are perfectly great places to have a profile, but you want to be careful entering into using those sites. Again, you want to monitor your publications list and make sure that it's accurate. So have they added other people's publications by mistake to your list of publications or vice versa? The other thing with ResearchGate is often they are hard to get a hold of. So I've tried to help people sort out like duplicate profiles before, and things like other people had taken credit for a person's work, and sometimes they are difficult to connect with. I just want to throw this out as kind of a case study example of ResearchGate. The person that I was working with had someone else take credit for their publications. Whether that was intentional or not, I don't know. ResearchGate could have, again, mismatched their publications and added them to this person's profile, and they may not even be aware of it. But on the other hand, this person did not have a ResearchGate profile, so they couldn't go in and actively curate their own list of things. So I'd say this is almost an argument for having a ResearchGate profile, because you're, instead of staying out of it altogether, you have some control over what presence you have there, if that makes sense. But it could go either way. So that's one that we're always here to talk if you want to kind of navigate the pros and cons of something like ResearchGate. I did see that there's a quick question in the chat. Yep. Okay. Do you advise us to have our own website? That's a great question. I'd say having your own website is a lot of work. And if you have time to maintain and keep a professional looking website, I think it's a great thing to do. You may be able to, again, like curate things in a different way. So if you've got things in Surface, you can link to all those different things. It may be a way to, add additional links to things like presentations. And so sure, I think it's a great thing to have if you can maintain it properly and if it looks professional. But I guess the other piece of this is, should you have all those research profiles? And the answer is, I think that you definitely want to have those essentials that we mentioned today, because again, if you're actively doing research or participating in like networking about research, you're going to need that ORCID ID, and that Google Scholar profile is something that people look for. But again, the more places, the more touch points that you can have for people to connect with you, that's a good thing. Next slide, please. Okay, I think that's, Brenna is going to talk about Publons, which is another research profile site.
Brenna, I think you're muted.
So sorry about that. Yes, Publons is another kind of profile that's relatively new. This tracks editor and reviewer activities. So if you have done a review of manuscripts or edited a book or a journal, any kind of activity like that, it will track that. So that's kind of a nice feature because that, in addition to having tracking profiles for your publishing, you can also sort of get the additional credit for any kind of editing or reviewing that you do. So this site is it's kind of a separate site and it's free, but it does extract data from Web of Science. So it has that data for just the typical citation metrics like we looked at earlier, but then it also adds in editor and reviewer activity as relevant. So I just wanted to mention that as kind of another profile site that also looks at kind of some different measures than what we've talked about previously. And I'll go through this very briefly. These are impact story we've already talked about. That's one way to kind of communicate as a researcher. Kudos is another site that we, Emily and I sort of found as we were preparing for this, this presentation. It's kind of, I think this is relatively new as well, where it sort of allows you to look at, you know, just another way to kind of connect with other researchers and get a list of your works. And you can also, you can link your Orcid and other kinds of profiles and social media accounts that you may have. And I wanted to mention also that with the these sort of screenshots of the names of the databases or tools that I have, they're hyperlinked, so you can click on them once the slides are available and go to that site directly, so you don't have to have all of these separate. And then impact story, as we've looked at, is another way to sort of communicate. And then I highly recommend, if you haven't, if you weren't able to attend her talk, but to refer back to her slides and her talk about a lot of tools that you can use to communicate, including listservs and social media, because that just sort of brings it all together for your visibility and sort of connecting with researchers and sort of developing that community like she was talking about so eloquently. And I've added a link here to her talk as well. So lastly, I think we're actually over a little bit. So I have a link here to the Research Metrics Challenge, which focuses on a lot of what we talked about today with sort of adding researcher profiles, using different tools. And so I don't think we'll have time so that we can ask or take any last questions. But something to think about is a Research Metrics Challenge that we have available on this guide link here. And that will, it has some actual challenges that you can do to have you like set up a profile, look at Sherpa Romeo to see if a journal that you're interested in publishing in, what their parameters or requirements are for, as we talked about earlier. So it has specific tasks or challenges that you can do, kind of sort of very much based on what we've talked about today. So if you want to take the time to sort of take a quick look at the guide, and could someone post that into the chat as well, since I can't get to it very easily right now.
the link?
I might be able to, but I think I'm going to share. The link is researchguides.library.syr.edu/RNC. So if you'd like to post it in the chat box, if you don't need to leave right away, and we can also take questions now as well. If you need to leave, that's fine. Our Emily and my emails are on the title slide, and I can pop that into the chat as well.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I would just like to say a very, very big thank you to you both. I'm sure you took some time to prep this and bring this all to us, and I really, really appreciate it. You two are both very much a wealth of knowledge and brought a lot of tools and tips to us today. And I so appreciate the connection between our last session. I'm so glad you were able to participate in that, because I think you really brought those two together as two different ways, to really boost our online professional profile. So thank you both so, so much. I know we're over time and I know folks have to go, and I so understand that. Just want to point out our evaluation and would love your feedback via the evaluation. I will follow up with slides and the recording this week. Thank you both so much for letting us capture both of those and share those. So those are coming. And with that, I'm going to stop talking in case others have questions for our speakers. But again, thank you all for participating.